For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on the gist today, we're looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis that it potentially could trigger across the globe. Our expert analyst today is Vikram Mehta. He's the chairman and distinguished fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP. He's also the editor of a book that we had reviewed on StratNews Global, The Next Stop, Natural Gas and India's Journey to a Clean Energy Future. And he's also been the former chairman of the Shell Group of companies in India. Let's start straight away, Mr. Mehta, with your assessment in terms of, petrol prices, diesel prices in India have been held at their November levels. Crude may have dropped off from 14-year highs, but what's your best case and worst case outlook for India's citizens because of the direct and indirect impact?
Well, the immediate direct impact, of course, is on the macroeconomy. A hike in the crude oil prices of $10 shaves off GDP by between 0.2 to 0.3%. That's the sort of estimate that analysts have given. But over and above that, it has an inflationary impact. There are foreign exchange impacts. Our current account deficit, of course, broadens. And we have a problem with the fiscal deficit. That deepens. So that's going to be an issue for us. And it's a major issue. Now, the question is whether that issue is going to get worse or improve. We don't know. Everything depends on the duration of the present crisis, the extent to which there are countervailing supply measures, such as a drawdown on strategic reserves by the International Energy Agency, or you might say by individual countries like the United States. The extent to which countries like Iran are able to release their blocked up capacity into the market. There's a lot of talk in the newspapers, at least, that were the nuclear deal with Iran to be finalized, Iran could release up to 1 million barrels a day of crude oil into the market. There's pressure being put on Saudi Arabia and the UAE to bring some part of their spare capacity into the market. They are the only countries that have significant spare capacity, approximately 3 million barrels a day. So far, the pressure hasn't really paid dividends. Saudi has insisted on keeping to the decision that was made by OPEC Plus to increase production by about 400,000 barrels a day every month. And they haven't really accepted the demands of the United States yet. So there are all these this complex of factors. There is also, of course, a concern that hasn't really been talked about, and that is whether that is the possibility that a wayward missile might hit the pipeline infrastructure that brings oil to Europe. And finally, of course, there is the issue of whether the current sanctions that have excluded the oil and gas market will cover Russian oil and gas exports. So today, only the US has sanctioned the exports of Soviet oil and Soviet gas, and so I don't know where the price could go. But if, of course, Russian gas and oil were taken out of the market, and the conflict was prolonged, we could well see prices going beyond $150 a barrel.
Wow. And how long? That's the external shock. Since November, like I pointed out, the government hasn't raised domestic petroleum petrol and diesel prices either for political reasons. In terms of the overall economic position, the RBI is a huge, forex reserve. Can that be cushioned?
Yes, of course it can. We have, we can cushion the hike in prices, but I think the big question for us is a political question, and that political question flows into the financial markets and also the well-being or the state of well-being of the Indian oil marketing companies. So if the government does not allow the oil marketing companies to pass on the hike in prices to the consumer, then they will issue a kind of an IOU to Indian Oil Company, BPCL, HPCL, which is tantamount to a receivable that will be paid at some point in the future. But these companies will face a huge cash loss because they're buying at a certain price and selling at a loss. And in order to cover that operating cash outflow, they will borrow from the banks, and these IOUs do not cover the interest payments that the oil companies incur. So at the end of the day, if the government does not allow these oil companies to pass on the hike in prices, the investment decisions of these companies will have to be reviewed. Many of them will not be able to proceed with the decisions that they'd already taken or committed to, and they will face a significant loss in the marketplace. BPCL disinvestment will probably have to be put on the back burner. So there are those consequences as well.
Right. I'm just going to take a question from a viewer for you, Mr. Mehta, from Chaitanya M, who says, the big question is if Indian refineries, except for RIL's Jamnagar, has the capability and capacity to process high impurity crudes, else it won't matter when the US lifts sanctions on the likes of Venezuela. We'll talk about that last point a little later. But his question, Mr. Mehta?
No, so the question is that can we process Russian crude? Is that the question?
High impurity crudes.
Yeah, Ural is sort of heavy
Jamnagar,
crude,
yeah.
and we don't depend on Ural crude or heavy crude very much. And the questioner is right. There are two refineries that are really very complex in their sort of processing structure. One is the RIL, the other is the Vadinar SR, formerly SR, now Nyara refinery. And those two refineries can actually process the heavy or high sulfur crude and produce the products that are in greatest demand in our economy and have high value added in the marketplace. That I don't think is the issue right now. We do have the refineries. At least 60% of our refineries can process a pretty broad mix of crudes.
Now, we're talking about the domestic need or demand for petroleum products, but what about the impact on, say, our earnings from petroleum products, which are what, like 14% of our exports?
Yeah, that was the case last year. I mean, we exported a mix of naphtha, diesel, petrol, and lube oils to the international market. And if I'm not wrong, we earned around $40 billion, which, accounted for the largest share of export earnings. Now, if global demand is impacted adversely because of the slowdown in the global economy as a result of what's happening around the world today and in Europe, then of course our exports of petroleum products will also suffer. But remember, petroleum products is processed by importing crude oil. We import 85% of our crude oil, which we then process, and refineries like Reliance, which as I said earlier, have the complexity to really mix and match the product portfolio, are able to then market their products to whichever market provides or gives them the highest value. But there will be an impact on that too.
Sure, obviously. But what do you think should or could happen to, say, Russian assets in India or Indian assets in Russia, petroleum I'm talking about, whether it's Sakhalin, and linked to that, reports suggesting that Russia is offering us discounted prices, hugely discounted prices, 27%, possibly lower. What should India be doing in your view?
Yeah, there are two parts to that question. So what will happen to the assets and what should we do? The assets are heavily undervalued. I mean, the value of those assets will be eroded, hugely eroded. So we have a 26% stake in an oil field. We have a 20% stake in the Sakhalin-1 LNG oil and LNG complex. And I understand that we have a few other smaller or lesser value assets. Now, let's take Sakhalin. Exxon is the other private sector partner in that complex, and Exxon has walked away from that asset. They have, in a way, impaired that asset, just like BP walked away from its 20% shareholding in Rosneft and took an impairment, or has taken an impairment, or should I say, will take an impairment of $25 billion. Now, those assets or those shareholdings are up for sale. And clearly, at one level, the value of our shareholding in those assets will come down. At another level, of course, it offers an opportunity to buy the assets of companies that have walked away, like Exxon or BP or Shell. Now, with regard to that, I think we face a moral dilemma. My own personal view is that it would be wrong for us to exploit or leverage this opportunity, because it would be unprincipled, it's opportunistic. And I would not recommend that the government look to acquiring the assets of Exxon or BP or Shell at, say, 10, 15, 20 cents on the dollar. That would be wrong. That would be unprincipled. On the other hand, when it comes to the acquisition of crude oil, there, at the moment, we have to look at it like, sorry, I keep saying Soviet for some reason. Russian oil and gas removed from the market. As I said earlier, the price of crude oil could go well beyond 150. And the misery that people are facing around the world today would get compounded. So it is important that Russian oil remain in the marketplace and that it has a market. So I am not going to suggest the same moral sort of constraint or impose the same moral constraint on the purchase of discounted or cheap Russian oil. What I will say, however, in sort of final remarks is, at a time like this, we, all of us, whether we're in decision-making positions or chiefs of oil companies or in government, we have to essentially ask ourselves the question: is there a trade-off between profits and principles? My own view is that, yeah, to an extent, it's often difficult to afford principles if you don't make profits. But I'm pretty clear that if you abridge principles, if you compromise your principles, then you don't deserve profits. So I would very much hope that the government of India and the oil companies will walk a very fine line and not look to leverage the opportunities that have been created because of a geopolitical crisis, and look to make short-term profits on that account.
And there is, of course, the threat of blowback if you're buying discounted oil from Russia and when the West is pushing for Russian oil to go off the market. But when you're talking about morality and principles, I
Well,
want your
on that, of
thoughts.
course, right now the West is not pushing because they haven't sanctioned Russian oil. Okay, only
Sure,
America has sanctioned Russian oil. The
sure,
West is still
sure,
buying Russian oil.
sure. Sure, sure. But I'm saying, like in the future, if you get into that pariah status, kind of like what happened with Iran when the U.S. Pressurized us. But since you're talking about morals and principles and interests, what your thoughts, Mr. Mehta, on say what the Americans are doing? I mean, first, the maximum sanctions against Iran, Venezuela, two regimes which they had sanctioned so. Horrendously in terms of the people there. But now we have reports, leaked reports suggesting that the Americans were trying to get the Venezuelans back in the market. The JCPOA, like you said, $1 million, 1 million barrels per day Iranian oil could come on. So the Americans and principles and interests, your thoughts on that in terms of Iran, Venezuela?
I think the Americans are hypocritical in their approach to the oil market. I would not for one moment condone the American approach to Venezuela or the way that they are looking to protect the their domestic constituency by ignoring everything that they've said about the regimes that currently hold the levers of you might say the oil market. So look, I cannot hold up a candle for the Americans. You know,
Right.
it is a very I understand that this leaked report has embarrassed the government and that they have now walked back from their overtures to the Venezuelans. But it is remarkable that a man that they had condemned, that they had sanctioned, President Maduro, suddenly becomes one of, suddenly is the person that they're going to cap in hand.
They don't recognize him. It's Garcia.
And they don't even
They
recognize
recognize
him,
as the
exactly,
president.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, so
On
don't get me
Iran,
wrong. I'm not, there's no moral equivalence here, okay? I'm just talking from
yeah,
our India standpoint. India is a principled, and our approach should be principled, and we don't draw on the examples of other countries to
absolutely.
establish our approach to the, to issues like this.
On Iran, when you were talking about India exploring, avenues there, do you think it'll have to wait till the JCPOA 2 is signed with the Russian and Iranian foreign ministers are currently meeting in Moscow? I think Salvatore Barbone has asked an Australian $10 question. What's the current state of play on Indian oil imports from Iran? As far as I know, I believe it was brought down to zero. But your thoughts on Iran, Mr. Mehta?
I have to admit that I don't see an early conclusion to the JCPOA discussions. That does not mean that the Iranian oil might not be allowed into the market. So I think the Americans might possibly consider easing off on their sanctions on Iranian exports, even ahead of the conclusion of the JCPOA talks. So this depends, of course, on the trajectory of oil prices. If the oil prices keep if they're at the current level of 106, 107, it's quite possible that we won't see pressure on America to release or to ease off on these sanctions. But I am of the view that if the prices start to ratchet upwards sharply, Americans will allow Iranian oil to get into the market again.
Seeing these old pictures of when the prime minister was in Iran and the last president, Riyasi there. In your recent writings in the Indian Express, Mr. Mehta, an interesting point you brought out, and that was headlined, I think it was autocrats and oil. And now you had pointed out how MBS, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping, and they probably think they're rational in their heads, but how it was affecting the rest of the world in several decisions. If you could expand on that a little bit.
Well, my point is that there are certain fundamentals that impact the oil market, and we must always consider them when evaluating the trajectory of the market. And those fundamentals are demand, supply, geopolitics, the speculative trade of Wall Street, exchange rates, because the price of oil is fixed in dollars. So that's what the analysts do. They look at it, they look at these fundamentals, and then they make a projection. But what they seem to, I think, miss out on is the fact that the major energy producers in this country, in this world, are actually led by individuals who have plenipotentiary powers over energy policy. So Saudi Arabia is under the control of Crown Prince MBS. Well, we know what about Russia. China is certainly going to be the leading player in energy, in clean energy issues. They have a chokehold over the minerals, the rare minerals, the components required for transiting from fossil fuels to clean energy. The only country, in some senses, which is a major player and is not sort of run by an autocrat, where the industry is not run by an autocrat, is United States. United States is today the leading oil and gas player in the world. It's the largest supplier of oil in the world today, and the industry is run by a mix of private companies who sell to the highest bidder. So yeah. I am essentially saying to people who are evaluating the market that, in addition to looking at these fundamentals, also understand the logic that drives the decision of individuals. If someone had read the biography of President Putin in 2014, there was an excellent biography written by a lady called Fiona Hill. I was just reading it again. You could have got a very good sense of how he was going to react if NATO were to enlarge its membership. I'm just saying that penetrate the mindset of these individuals. Don't bring in a psychologist, if you will, into your analytical room and ask the question, what drives these men? What personal predilection, what political ambition drives the decisions of people, of these 3, 4, 5 people? So that's what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying that is the sole, that should be the only focus. I'm saying that should be an additional element in your analysis.
You mentioned earlier India's strategic reserves. We saw the West-led release of oil from the strategic reserves. Could you expand and explain a little bit more on that? I do remember in 2018, there was a crucial deal with the UAE for reserves that were brought in. I think we have something with the US. I'm not really sure on that. So if you could help us understand that.
Well, my suggestion to the government is that we have to enlarge our strategic reserves. My understanding is that we have 8 to 9 days of strategic reserves. We've built up capacity to cover 8 to 9 days of our consumption, about 5 million tons. We have 3 caverns, and that can store 5 million tons of crude oil. Yes, UAE has supplied crude, but as I understand it, that's on sort of it still belongs to UAE, but it can be used by us if need be. But we need to enlarge our reserves, because we have to frame now, or we have to recognize that our energy policy, and that is not just crude oil and gas, it's crude oil, gas, and clean energy as well, has to be framed within the framework of volatility, continuing volatility. And we have to prepare for the unexpected. So one way of doing that would be to actually build up storage facilities in our own country. So from 5 million tons or 8 to 9 days of reserves, I would recommend that we go to at least 30 days. Many other countries have up to 90 days. Some have 120. IEA recommends 90 days. I would say we have to go up to at least 30, and we should build reserves in sort of locations that allow allow hinterland refineries to access those reserves very quickly. There's no point building reserves and not also then connecting those reserves to refineries in the center of the country through pipelines and so on. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is we should anticipate volatility, and we should prepare for the unexpected. And the one way of doing it would be to build up our strategic reserves.
One of the other points you mentioned was the need to rapidly decouple from China in terms of rare earths or components that allow us to transition to cleaner energy. In that light, I just want to take two questions and you can expand on that, Mr. Mehta. Kurt Cobain, who says, what's the best way forward for India when it comes to energy security in the mid to long term? Could nuclear, solar energy be reliable and sufficient? And ADYPD, who says, how urgent do you think energy transition becomes in light of what's happening now? Do things get expedited?
Well, I think the transition to a non-fossil fuel energy system gets even more urgent today than ever before. And it's not just driven by climate change and global warming. That in itself is the reason for the transition. But India is particularly vulnerable, and this Ukraine crisis has, in a sense, brought that vulnerability into sharp relief. We're not only vulnerable to imports of fossil fuels, we're also vulnerable to our dependence on China for imports of rare earths and semiconductors and today, of course, many of the minerals that we need, whether it's neon, whether it's gas like neon gas, or whether it's palladium, that are also essential for our economy, are all imported, and they're imported from countries like Russia, like Ukraine, in China, which are currently in the midst of a major geopolitical crisis. So the first and foremost, I think, emphasis for India has to be to build up, to accept that we have to become really self-reliant. Now, that's not an easy, that's easy to say, very difficult to achieve. Self-reliance will also, I think, happen if we can diversify our sources of supplies. So I'm going to recommend three things. One is that in the short term, we should look to diversify away from oil to gas. And in that context, this is of course not going to happen, but I certainly think it's worth contemplating reviving a conversation with Iran and Turkmenistan on sort of a transnational gas pipeline. The reason I'm mentioning this is because I do feel that gas has a role to play as a bridge fuel in the future. Second is that we have to recognize that we cannot remain dependent on China for our clean energy transition. So we have to start looking for supplies from elsewhere, and also actually look to develop our own indigenous reserves. And third is that I've already mentioned strategic reserves, so that also has to be enhanced. So that's another very important. But in addition to that, I think our exploration and sort of efforts have to be a holistic effort. We must now look at energy through a holistic lens, wherein we bring all decision making related to energy, related to the enhancement of our indigenous energy resources under one decision-making body. Today we have 7 different ministers looking at aspects of energy. And so we have a Minister of Petroleum, a Minister of Coal, Ministry of Renewables. We have, of course, the Niti Aayog and so on. I'm saying now let's just put it all together and see energy look at it through an integrated frame. So those are things that I would do in order to actually enhance our energy security in the medium to long term.
And what do you think the impact of the Russia-China partnership is? I mean, before the Olympics, we saw both the presidents meeting and a huge joint statement, lots of agreements signed, new pipeline that they're talking about. Now the Americans, Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi meet, and there's a warning to China not to help Russia. How do you see that dynamic, and how does it impact India?
Well, it's an interesting dynamic. There's no doubt that insofar as at least energy is concerned, China and Russia are in a tighter embrace than they were, last year. So there was a gas pipeline called the Power of Siberia 1 that was providing Russian gas from Russia, from Siberia to China. That had been commissioned and the gas was flowing through it. But last month, in fact, just a week before the Ukrainian invasion, the Chinese, Russians and Chinese signed another agreement called Siberia, Power of Siberia 2. And that is a pipeline that's going to be built. And there were many other commitments that were made at the time of the meeting ahead of the Winter Olympics, and then at subsequent meetings. So on energy, they have actually gone into a tighter embrace. This has to be a matter of concern to India, because we are, as I said, dependent on China for our a large part of the components that go into clean energy. We have a relationship with Russia, but we have a fractious relationship with China as far as the geopolitics is concerned. So where do we sort of come out on this? But we have recognized that at the end of the day, in geopolitics, Lord Palmerston saying that we have no permanent friends, we just have permanent interests, is being brought into sharp relief. And that's probably where we have to come out too, so long as we stay with our principles.
Quick responses to a couple of questions. These are related. We did talk about it earlier, Mr. Mehta, but Piyush asks the impact which India is going to face from Western countries after, that is, if India buys Russian oil at a discounted price. And Knight Library, who says people high on emotions in the West are calling for secondary sanctions on India after Iran and Venezuela. How long can India sustain a one-sided friendship with the high cost of a Russian ban?
Well, as I said, I think there's going to be a lot of press commentary. There's going to be editorials against India. We have, I think, a logic for buying Russian crude. We will have difficulty explaining to the world why we bought Russian assets. All right.
Yeah.
I think that's let's make sure that what we do on the basis of very clearly enunciated principles, and let's not be afraid of brickbats, because no one in the West can afford to throw stones at us, because they themselves have actually been pretty ambivalent about their principles.
Would you recommend this? I doubt you would recommend this, but Kali says, can we move to convert coal to gas? Technology is available for the same and we have coal reserves.
Oh, I've always recommended coal gasification. I've recommended it for the last 20 years. I would definitely urge the government to look at coal gasification technologies, very seriously. Of course, in addition to, cleaning or greening coal through other technologies. So yes, I do recommend it.
You talked about Turkmenistan. Now, again, there are geopolitical barriers, there are physical barriers when it comes to Pakistan, if you're talking about TAPI. But an interesting question from Mayank, can we lay undersea pipelines from Iran or Saudi Arabia to India? It should be easier to set this up than Nord Stream over a half-frozen Baltic Sea.
Well, that's certainly a route that's been explored earlier. So the on-land transnational pipeline, Iran, Pakistan, India, has a major problem, and that's of course, the security issue. Although at one time, and this is 20 years ago, when relations were not as, you might say, tense with Pakistan as they are today, or not as unsteady as they are today, there were conversations on how we can come up with a commercial arrangement, let's say, whereby if one party takes a decision to hurt the other, they hurt themselves. So gas flowing from Iran, let's say Pakistan, to a power plant in Amritsar to provide electricity to Lahore is a way of locking all parties into a mutually beneficial arrangement. Now that's academic stuff. We can all talk about how to do it, but ultimately this kind of a pipeline is only going to be built if the geopolitics allows it. But there is an alternative route, and that is the subsea route, and it has been explored. And when I suggest that we start reviving conversations, I'm actually suggesting that we look at all routes now. Let's be very clear: we are not going to remove our dependence on oil and gas for decades to come. Okay, we will need oil, we will need gas. What will happen is that the share of fossil fuels in our energy basket is going to come down, and the effort must be to bring it down as sharply as possible, for all the reasons that we know. But we're not. It's going to be a long while before we are going to move towards a completely non-fossil fuel energy system. So in that kind of a scenario, it's, I think, imperative that we look at gas as a very important fuel, and we tap gas from as many different sources as possible. And that's why it's, I think, important that we consider all options, including the option of a transnational pipeline, from Turkmenistan or from Iran.
Mr. Mehta, if you want to wrap up your thoughts, do you agree with some analysts who are saying that it's not just a new world order because of what Russia has been doing that is coming into place? It's a new world energy order. I mean, you look at the Saudis or American allies, but MBS is more with Putin in terms of oil. You have Venezuela and Iran, who the US had imposed sanctions on, but now may want their oil. The EU is heavily dependent on Russia. China, Russia partnership, India looking for various options. Is there a new energy order that is being shaped here, or realignment?
Oh, without a shadow of doubt. I mean, you have explained, in fact, in your question, you've just provided the contours of that new energy order. But to elaborate a little bit on that, China, Russia embrace, we've already talked about. US emerging as the largest oil producer in the world is a second factor. It will soon become the largest LNG exporter in the world. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries emerging as the only companies which have low cost spare capacity, or let me put it, spare low cost crude oil capacity. And so they remain the kind of swing players in the oil and gas market. Then you have the geopolitics of new energy. Remember, the geopolitics of fossil fuel, which we are all familiar with, is now going to be superimposed with the new geopolitics, or the geopolitics of new energy, where China, Congo, Russia, some countries in South America are going to hold the critical ingredients required to make the transition from fossil fuels to, clean energy. So these are again countries that don't necessarily fall neatly into the so-called democratic, liberal, frame that makes at least some of the people comfortable. These are countries that are also run by individuals who have strong autocratic authority over their country. So here again, India has to navigate the geopolitics of fossil fuels and the geopolitics of clean energy. India is particularly vulnerable because amongst all these countries that we've talked about, it is one of the very few countries that is import dependent and does not have the strategic reserves or the storage facility to manage the unexpected. And so back to, if we wrap up, is India now has to focus to overcome this vulnerability. It has to create resources within the country that allows it to manage the volatility of fossil fuel market and the clean energy market. Don't forget, that's the real challenge that we're going to face. And so, yes, it's a totally new energy order.
Vikram Singh Mehta, thank you so much for your time, your experience, and your expertise that you shared with us on StratNews Global and with all our viewers.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
The pleasure was all ours, and thank you to all our viewers who have stayed through this discussion and who have helped us cross that 100,000 subscriber mark. We're now looking to you to get us to the next 100,000. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.